Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Pride and Prejudice. The Horrible Mr. Collins, Chapter 5. The next morning, the sisters agreed that Jane was well enough to leave Netherfield, and Elizabeth wrote to tell her mother. Mrs. Bennett would have preferred them to remain at Netherfield for the following week, but Elizabeth was determined and urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately. Bingley greeted this request with genuine regret, but Jane stood her ground. You have been extremely kind to me, and I think your sister is mine better now, and it's time for me to return home. To Mr. Darcy, it was welcome news. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. He was becoming too attracted to her. To discourage her from thinking he would pay her any more attention, he did not bother to say goodbye. On Sunday, after church, the Bennett girls returned to Longbourn. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennett to his wife at breakfast the following morning, that you ordered a lot for dinner, because I expect an additional guest. What do you mean? She asked. It is my cousin, Mr. Collins, the man who will inherit my money in this house when I die. Don't talk to me of that horrible man, cried his wife. It is the cruelest thing in the world that your estate should be taken away from your children. Mr. Collins sent me a letter, explained Mr. Bennett. He has been ordained a minister and in the parish of the Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh. He feels badly about the inheritance. In fact, he says it is a duty to promote peace. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennett as he folded up the letter. The Bennett family was divided as this relative of theirs. Mrs. Bennett was anxious that Mr. Collins be convinced to make amends. Elizabeth thought him likely to be odd, and her father always found him to be a strange mixture of humbleness and self-importance. All the family was interested in meeting him. Mr. Collins was on the time and was greeted with great politeness. He was an overweight man of 25, with a puffed-up air and stiff manners. He complimented the Bennets on their beautiful daughters and slyly hinted at a marriage to one of them. During dinner, Mr. Bennett asked about Mr. Collins' patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Collins was full of her praise. Lady Catherine is all one could wish for in a person of importance. Such manners, such style. She advises me to marry as soon as possible. Elizabeth and Jane exchanged secret smiles. What a funny man! He must possess the talent of flattery, observed Mr. Bennett, who found his cousin absurd as he remembered. But it was not poor Mr. Collins' fault. He was just not a sensible man. As a boy, he had been wrongly taught flattery was the answer to ignorance and fear, both of which traits he had much of. As such, he was a source of comedy to the Bennett girls. They hated how he worshipped Lady Catherine. They preferred more independent, honest men. Still, Mr. Collins could boast of a good house and income and such. He was considered a good catch, certainly by himself. And he did feel badly about the estates in hopes of being friends with the Bennets, but his solution was to marry one of the daughters. In this way, he thought he could make up for them inheriting their father's estate. He didn't realize how ridiculous his mannerings made him to Elizabeth and Jane, at least. Moreover, Collins thought them all lovely. In order to get to know them better, he suggested them to take a walk in the town of Meryton. But there, the attention of how the ladies was soon caught by another man whom they had never seen before. Through their friend Mr. Denny, introduced his friend Mr. Wickham, who was an officer in the army. The Bennets were quite taken with Mr. Wickham, who was dashing and pleasant. They hadn't spoken to Wickham long when they saw Darcy and Bingley riding down the street. Elizabeth noticed Wickham and Darcy looking at each other in astonishment. Both men were flushed. Then they set off. Was there trouble between Wickham and Darcy, she wondered? The other Bennett girls were too busy with Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham to notice. The soldiers escorted the young ladies to the door to their uncle's house and accepted an invitation to stay for dinner. Although every woman who was present noticed Mr. Wickham, he chose to sit next to Elizabeth. They quickly fell into easy conversation. was such a rival for the ladies' attention as Mr. Wickham, poor Mr. Collins seemed to disappear from view. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.